Hi, this is Peter Mortola. Play Becomes Real, the Oaklander approach to Gestalt play and art therapy, and this is part 3 of this lecture series, Contact, Regulation, and Process. So we're going to be going over those 3 things in this talk. First, I want to go back to our last talk, First Steps, in which we covered examples of the Oaklander therapeutic experiences such as drawing, sand tray, clay work. We talked about the 4-part structure of the Oaklander therapeutic experiences: imagine it, make it, be it, does it fit? And those were part of the example prompts from each of those 4 parts that we spoke about. The valid and invalid uses of projection, meaning that projection is something that happens, that we do. We make sense of the world through what we imagine, the sense we're making of it, but we have to be careful of our own interpretations of clients' work when they bring it to us. We talked about the connections between projection and Gestalt formation and closure, specifically this idea of the need organizing the field. I will talk more about that today a bit, and then how Gestalt formation is related to the identification of needs. So yeah, we talked about this idea of fantasy becoming real in these projective exercises that Oaklander leads people through, and how that playful experience allows us access to something real and authentic about our life. So yeah, this is Lewin's quote, "The need organizes the field." So we tend to move toward things that we need, and that is the process of regulation, which I'll be saying more about. Today, we're going to be talking about 3 aspects of this: contact, regulation, and process. And I'm going to ask you to identify 3 important types of contact, the 4 aspects involved in having good contact with the self, and how rebuilding connection is the key to trauma work, trauma-informed work, how both internalizing and externalizing behaviors are related to poor contact, how contact is related to self-regulation, and then examples of physiological, emotional, and cognitive regulation. And all this is, I'm going to feed into how this makes sense regarding Oaklander's therapeutic process. So I'm going to start with this idea of contact. And we've been staring at these screens now, and so I'm going to invite you to stand up and stretch out a little bit like this anemone here. Feel your feet rooted into the ground, wiggle your toes a bit, and then feel those tentacles like this anemone reaching out into the environment, stretching. It is at the edge of anything system or medium that the most interesting events take place. So it's at our fingertips, really. It's at the edge of these anemones' tendrils that life and contact happen with the things that we need. Making contact with the environment like this anemone does. When you poke this anemone, it shrinks into itself. You might do that yourself. Notice that your back rounds, your hands get pulled in. You have this ability to contract, to withdraw, just like this anemone does. So we're going to be talking about this pulsation between contact and withdrawal as a fundamental principle of this work, and really a fundamental goal of helping kids make good contact in our work with them. So this is sort of an underlying philosophical premise from Buber that informs Oaklander's work. All real living is meeting. And we don't mean, meetings after school. We mean making contact with the world, like this child's hand is making contact with a very significant other. So there's 3 kinds of contact that we're going to be talking about, 3 kinds of meeting that are key for ongoing healthy existence. The first is our ability to make good contact with ourself. One quote related to this is, "The interoceptive system constitutes a representation of the material me, providing a foundation for subjective feelings, emotions, and self-awareness." So all these drawings in the left-hand slide, picture on the slide there, are our ability to be aware of our senses, our smell, our touch. There's the heart and our heart rate, what we're thinking. And then in the drawing on the right, all those are integrated into the self, and we're using all that information that we have that is part of us. So that contact with the self is a key aspect of vital existence. And emotion is a part of this contact with the self, right? And it's key. Emotions are the integrative awareness of a relation between the organism and the environment. This is a quote from Gestalt founders Pearls, Hefferline, and Goodman. So, this relationship of me with the world and our emotion telling me my status of that relationship. It is a good thing. Is it something I'm longing for, like this child? That's why it's important to have good contact with ourself and our own emotions. So Oaklander says, as children become disconnected from their bodies, they lose a sense of self and a great deal of physical and emotional strength as well. So we need to provide methods for helping them regain their bodies, to help them know their bodies, be comfortable with them, and learn them how to use them again. So this is a pretty foundational piece that I really always appreciated about Violet's work, is that she starts with the physical, emotional, sensory self and good contact with that self. Because without that, we can't go on and do the difficult work of living, whether that involves addressing difficult emotional content in our life or going out into the world and getting our needs met. So she says, it is up to me to provide the means by which we will open doors and windows to their inner worlds. What I do mostly is to very gently and softly help the child open the doors of self-awareness and self-ownership. So this is the windows to our children, right? It's children are using their own windows to themselves and trying to understand and open those doors and understand what their own experience is, because that is a key foundational piece to understanding their place in the world and how they make sense of the world. So the second kind of contact, just as important, is contact with others, right? So Siegel defines this in this way. Insight is the ability to sense your own inner mental life. So that's sort of like contact with the self we've been talking about, insight. But empathy is the ability to sense the inner mental life of another person. Without this kind of contact with others, we would not thrive either as individuals or as a species. Wilhelm Reich, in fact, says the first striving of any living organism will be a striving for contact with the outer world, and really contact with another person, right? The infant roots to find nourishment from the mother, learns how to cling, learns how to make contact with a physical person in a very physical way so that they can thrive. But a key sort of third aspect of contact is this ability to be in good contact with the environment. So contact with the self, contact with other people, and then contact with the environment. And Wright goes on to say, the personality derives at first only one striving, that of eliminating inner tensions, really inner needs, right? Impossible without contact with the outer world. So here a child's drinking a lovely sip of water. We talked about this walking through Pioneer Square and realizing that you're thirsty. We identify the need, and in order to eliminate that tension, that need, we need to make contact with the environment. So this is a really key piece, I think, connecting this approach to Levine's work and trauma-related work, trauma-informed practice. Levine goes on to say, rebuilding connection is really the key, because trauma is about loss of connection, loss of contact. First to the body and the self, and second to others and the environment. So all three types of contact are mentioned there: contact with the body and the self, contact to others, and contact to the environment. So these otters who actually make contact with each other when they sleep so they don't drift away from each other demonstrate the importance of good contact with others. And Levine underlines this importance of just this work of contact and helping kids make good contact with themselves, good contact to others, and good contact with the environment. And as we go through this class, we'll talk about how and what that looks like. So Oaklander says, I work to build the child's sense of self, to strengthen the contact functions, and to renew her own contact with her senses, body, feelings, and intellect. So this is another key piece of Oaklander's work, which is this idea of the sense of self. And without a clear sense of one's own senses, body, feelings, and intellect, we can't make good contact with the world. And so we strengthen the contact functions, which are literally the senses, right? Seeing, smelling, touching, tasting. Those are the contact functions, as well as the feelings and the intellect. So those are the helping the organism be in touch with the ways in which we make contact with the world. So she goes on to state, like these girls are demonstrating here, ideal contact is having all of yourself present in a situation, your senses, your body, your emotions, and your intellect. All right, a more sort of theoretical model of contact is the Gestalt cycle of experience. So you can see in the left-hand part of this squiggle drawing that there's the word withdrawal. So that's in the state of sort of equilibrium with ourself, right? And with the environment. We're not hungry, we're not thirsty. But then we get this sensation, man, my mouth is dry. And an awareness of that, I come to think, wow, I need to get something to drink. So I mobilize my energy, I pick up the glass that's in front of me, I take action, I make contact with my glass and the water in it. That water gets integrated and assimilated into my physical self. And then I'm back to a state of withdrawal, waiting for the next need to emerge, right? So that is the process of Gestalt formation and closure that we talked about. I've done a modified drawing of this to try to also demonstrate another piece of this. So the Dolphin Squiggle there is his ability to leap out of the water, make contact with the world, come back into the water, right? That contact boundary, the yellow part, is the boundary between the self and the environment. So the self, again, the senses, the body, the feelings, the intellect, the environment, the social environment, cultural, familial, physical, needing to make contact. The dolphin needs to get air to breathe, but he lives in the water. So this ongoing squiggle, this ongoing leap out and back in, contact and withdrawal, is the healthy process of contact and withdrawal. We need to do that. There are ways in which the DSM has categorized when we're not making good contact. They might not use that language, but if we get stuck in behaviors that are what are deemed externalizing behaviors, such as ADHD, opposition defiance disorder, aggression, social problems, drug abuse, those are all underregulated aspects of the self where the boundary into the environment is crossed inappropriately. And many boys, on average, are categorized in this area where they're making inappropriate contact with the world, and we need to help them regulate themselves more and dial back the externalizing contact with the world and understand more about their own feelings and contact with self in order to make better contact with the world. On the bottom of the graphic is internalizing disorders. Somatization, anxiety, depression, thought disorders, eating disorders. These are examples of being overregulated, overly constrained, not good contact with the environment. These, on average, girls struggle more with these, and I'm not saying that genders across all, or that people across all genders don't struggle with all of these, but on average, we know that more girls struggle with internalizing disorders. So we can help them make better contact with the world, vocalize what they're feeling, make demands be known, the ability to say no. These kinds of practice in this healthy contact is what Violet has taught me about this work. Is kids need practice with this ongoing healthy process of contact and withdrawal, and we can make an assessment of what kind of contact they need help with. So again, making connections to trauma-based work, children with early relational trauma, histories of maltreatment, and disruptions in their earliest relationships have been shown to be at significant risk for both internalizing and externalizing behavior problems. So the work that often needs to happen with children who have had trauma is to help them make better contact, starting with themselves, then with their world and people in it. Okay, so Violet says, the healthy, uninterrupted development of a child's senses, body, feelings, and intellect is the underlying base of the child's sense of self. A strong sense of self makes for good contact with the environment and the people in that environment. All right, so I'm going to make a connection here then. We've made a connection between projection, gestalt formation, and contact in that we move toward the things we need to keep us growing and healthy. And projected exercises often bring into figure what those needs are. I'm going to link these ideas to this bigger concept of regulation, which we know from the literature is becoming more and more an important understanding of what kids need in our work with them. So I want to describe this process of organismic self-regulation being the creative adjustment that the organism makes in relation to the environment. So like this lizard here has lost his tail, and he has the amazing ability to self-regulate to reconstruct a tail. We don't have that ability, but we do have the ability to modify our behavior, modify ourselves, our world, as we adjust to what's going on in the environment. And that's this ongoing process of organismic self-regulation. So this is an organismically based theory, meaning it's related to this idea that in biology, any organism is any contiguous living system, such as animal, fungus, microorganism, or plant, capable of response to stimuli, reproduction, growth and development, and maintenance of homeostasis as a stable whole. I think there's really two key pieces to homeostasis here, because one is just the ability to get enough water for this plant, to make sure it's not too hot and too cold in the environment. You know, it sheds its leaves in the winter when it doesn't want to be exposed. That's a sort of example of contact and withdrawal and regulation. But, you know, there's also this ongoing process of development, which this plant also demonstrates, and we as humans do, which is that we get more complex, and the environment, we are changing as the environment is changing. So not only are we trying to maintain homeostasis and balance, we're also developing at the same time, and homeostasis is involved in that as well, as I'll be describing. Okay, so this picture shows the habitable zone of our planet. Not too hot if you were on the inside of the circle, and not too cold on the outside. So all life has to find a a place within a zone of regulation that is healthy. So Damasio talks about our brain, and really the entire collection of homeostatic processes governs life moment by moment in every cell of our bodies. That's what we're trying to do, is stay within the healthy zone, not too hot, not too cold. He goes on to say, a means to appraise the internal and external circumstances of an organism and act accordingly. So we're constantly in this negotiation with the environment, not too hot, not too cold, not too little, not too much, but we're also acting as a process and responding to that environment. So Nadine Burke Harris makes this connection in terms of her work on trauma work, where she refers to the stress response. So she's talking about, you know, getting all of a sudden there's a bear in front of you and you head back to your cave. This is in prehistoric times. Once you get away and are back to the safety of your cave, the body uses a sort of stress thermostat called feedback inhibition that triggers the stress response to turn itself off once it has done its job. So we know that the ongoing stress problems and trauma work that people face is that this regulatory process of turning the stress thermostat off, of being able to cool down, of being able to regulate the system, is a problem for people who have experienced a lot of trauma, and that's what they need practice in regulating. She goes on to talk about meditation, food, diet, social relationships as being the processes by which people do learn to regulate again. So my friend Daniel Schiff talks about this ongoing process of regulation as the heart of life is a pulse. And truly, our heart is pulsing. It is dilating, opening, and contracting 60 times a minute or so. It's also happening in our lungs. We take a deep breath. We take oxygen into our system. We exchange that when we release it, carbon dioxide into the environment. So we're constantly in this pulsation of negotiation with the environment and what our needs are and regulation. So Wright goes on to say that living functioning in man is basically no different from that of an amoeba. Its basic criterion is biological pulsation. So here's my son telling me to pay attention to the lovely creatures in front of us at the aquarium. So we're no different than that in terms of our ability to expand and contract to reach out into the environment and then contract from that environment, whether that's going out in the daytime, coming in at night, whether it's calling a friend and getting what we need and then hanging up, whether it's getting food and eating it and then being sated. So this process of biological pulsation, this alternating complete contraction and expansion, most readily, Reich says, is seen in the cardiovascular system, which I've been describing, but in various organs it takes a different form according to their structure. So not only at the organ level, but then at the system level, we have both the sympathetic system and this parasympathetic system, which are about contraction and expansion, right? So when we see the tiger in the environment or stress, our pupils dilate. This is our flight or fight response system. Our heart rate increases, our lungs expand so we can take in more oxygen if we need to run, right? The opposite is when we rest. So our pupils constrict, literally. We slow the heart rates and our airways get constricted because we don't need as much. So at a very physiological, basic level, we are in this process of contraction and expansion, contact and withdrawal. This also is true at the emotional level, and this is really what the emotions are doing for us. Damasio says, from chemical homeostatic processes to emotions proper, life regulation phenomena, without exception, have to do with the integrity and health of the organism. So I've lined up our basic emotions here. On the left is the more open, expansive feelings of happiness. Our face literally opens up, our mouth opens, our eyes widen. When we feel a little bit of sadness, we're still in touch with the environment, we're still in contact, but we're starting to close down, hoping to get help. Surprise is kind of in the middle. We're not sure whether we should contract or move in. It could be a good surprise or a negative surprise. But anger is definitely setting a boundary, saying, this will not do. You must stop. We set a boundary at the at our boundary of contact with the world. And then we've got disgust, which is literally pulling away from the world. Our nose goes up, our lips retreat, our head pulls back because of that thing we stepped on. And fear is retreat, right? So on the left, we're in contact with the world. On the right, as we get down, we're sort of moving away from that contact. So even emotions are helping us with this expansion and contraction, this pulsation of contact and withdrawal. So Dan Siegel goes to state, emotion involves complex layers of processes that are in constant interaction with the environment. So again, this sense of a thermometer telling us what the outdoor temperature is, what our indoor temperature is. We feel cooler when the environment is cooler, when things are going on. We feel warmer when the environment helps us feel warmer. It's part of this ongoing contact with the world and ourself. So it's interesting that at the brain level, this is also true about contact and withdrawal. There is a time lag, Steinberg talks about in development, between the activation of brain systems that excite our emotions and impulses and the maturation of brain systems that allow us to check these feelings and urgings. It's like driving a car with sensitive gas pedal and bad brakes. So gas pedal is moving into the environment, making contact. Brakes are this ability to stop our contact if we need to. So our brain is literally designed in this dialectic way of having a response at the amygdala level, and then having these very thoughtful, limiting, planful, um, uh, organizational thought processes at the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is the main brain area responsible for self-regulation. The limbic system plays an especially important role in generating emotions. The story of adolescence, childhood, adulthood is the story of how these regions learn to work together. So I underline this because both of these functions are key at the cognitive level of regulation. And I've been trying to underline how so far at the physiological level, at the emotional level, at the cognitive level, this process of ongoing regulation, contact and withdrawal, opening and closing is a pattern. Piaget goes on to talk about in the act of knowing, the subject is active, and faced with an external disturbance, he will react in order to compensate and will tend towards equilibrium. Equilibration is thus an active process. It's a process of self-regulation. So Piaget, obviously focused more on intellectual development, and so at the intellectual level, we also have this equilibration process happening where we're creating, if we get new information and it throws us off, we have to balance our own understanding of that information and create new maps in order to make a better approximation of what the world we're presented with. So Duncan says, equilibration refers to the biological drive to produce an optimal state of equilibrium between people's cognitive structures and their environment. So learning is about this. We're thrown with new math problems. We have to figure out how to make how to solve that math problem. In doing that, we get better equilibrium because we're matching the demands of sixth grade math, for example. But the environment is always changing and our cognitive abilities are always changing, so it's this ongoing process of equilibration. So Steinberg, underlining the capacity for self-regulation is probably the single most important contributor to achievement, mental health, and social success. So this is a photo of the famous marshmallow test where this child is deciding whether to eat that marshmallow now, use her gas pedal and move forward and grab that thing, or to inhibit, to withdraw from that marshmallow for 10 minutes because if she does, then she can get 2 of them if she just waits a little bit longer. So this process of self-regulation, this process of delayed gratification is the ability to regulate between our desires, needs, impulses, and what the environment is presenting us. And Steinberg says this is fundamental to our achievement, mental health, and social success. So I'm going to make another link back to Traumainformed work, which is this work that in restorative justice and restorative dialogue that's been done. Marilyn Armour says, much of the behavior that has been deemed criminal is related to brain development and trauma-infused environments, areas that require interventions aimed at increasing self-regulation as well as relational and social skills. So again, underlining the importance of helping kids self-regulate. In this circle environment here, they're learning to understand the hurt that has been that they've inflicted on others and trying to come to reparations with that, come to some restorative sense of justice, and in that process have a better contact with the environment and contact with their own needs as they state them. All right, so I've got this picture of this kayaker who's navigating the rapids, right? Because too far to one side, like the planet I was showing earlier, is not a healthy place. In this case, it would be rocks. Too far to the other side, there's a big hole that he doesn't want to fall into either. So this process of regulation is really a process of navigation and negotiation between our needs and the environment, between what polarities are presented us, between the danger zones on the extremes and yet our ability to understand a healthy amount of contact. So this is a bit of a summary. Regulation, navigation, negotiation is a fluid and ongoing process of adjustments, corrections, adaptations, at the physical, emotional, social, and intellectual levels, within parameters, within boundaries, within extremes that are established. These parameters, boundaries, and extremes are established, they're necessary, they're containing, meaning within a range of behavior, within a range that can happen within a classroom. Those are constraints. And the successful result of this regulation, navigation, negotiation allows for further movement, development, capacity, and complexity. So this ongoing process of meeting challenges, negotiating those challenges, addressing our own needs, negotiating those needs is what develops, what development is, which is the ability to have more capacity and more complexity. So Pearls, Hefferlein, and Goodman, again from a Gestalt perspective, say the materials and energy of growth are the conservative attempt of the organism to remain as it has been. We just want to exist. But then the environment changes, whether the novel environment, whether that's an internal environment or an external environment. The destruction of previous partial equilibria. So we used to be in some kind of equilibrium, but now we've got this new challenge and the assimilation of something new. So this young woman is in her apartment, let's say, it's winter, it's not as warm in the environment, so she makes the move to wrap herself up in this blanket, which helps her at the physical level regulate. She has tea, which also is helping her regulate. She's studying, which is bringing in new information, which is destroying in some ways, or at least changing, modifying the equilibrium she had prior to this moment. And this is the ongoing process of regulation and development. So Piaget says all development is composed of these kinds of momentary conflicts and incompatibilities which must be overcome to reach a higher level of equilibrium. So that's what's happening. Like this child used to just walk, now can ride and balance on a bike without training wheels, negotiating the world in a more complex, more sophisticated way. The child gets its needs met for exploration and a greater sense of what the world is through having a bicycle to move out into these ongoing processes of, but still is having to maintain balance, right? On the bike, this very basic idea of not going too far to the left, not going too far to the right, while they're moving forward in their complex development in the world. So Violet, bringing this back to this practice, as his senses awaken, as he begins to know his body again, as he recognizes, accepts, and expresses his buried feelings, as he learns to use his intellect to make choices and to find satisfying, healthy ways to get his needs met, he will once again find his rightful path of growth. This is really important to me because it underlies how in this practice, in this theory, there is this idea that children want to do well and are able to do well. They do have this capacity to regulate because they're born with it. And we need to help them in that process of re-identifying how to regulate, what it's like to regulate, what it's like to get your needs met, what it's like to understand what your needs are, and how to reach out to the world with healthy contact. How does she do this? Well, she has this last piece I'm going to talk about is the therapeutic process. So she's got these 5 steps that I think line up with this idea of self-regulation and contact. So the very first thing is she establishes a therapeutic relationship. It's not hierarchical. She works on that relationship at a very human level. It's an I-thou relationship, but she does set boundaries and limits. These are the kinds of constraints that you are going to have in this room. You know, you can hit this clay as hard as you want on the table, but you may not throw it against the window. So she's in a relationship. She uses that relationship to help the kid understand what the parameters are, but also understand what the possibilities, the supportive possibilities are. Secondly, she's working on contact. It's established and evaluated at every session. She checks out the fluidity of contact and the energy. Is that child able to make contact? Are they completely withdrawn? Are they in too much hyper contact with the environment and need to learn to settle? She also talks about the role of resistance being a really key thing, that, it's healthy for a kid to resist an adult telling them what to do. And she honors that resistance and tries to work more gently with them, helping them make contact. At this stage in the therapeutic process, she's really, again, working on the contact functions, making sure they see well, hear well, smell, touch, taste, so they can have, in number 3, the self-support of a strength, of a strong sense of self, right? If all their self is there, then they are able to feel their body, understand the use of their senses, understand what their emotions are doing, and think about the integrated functioning of all of those parts are what create a strong sense of self. And through that, and really only then, does she go on to emotional expression work. So we don't immediately go to, what are you feeling? We first work with building a child's sense of self. And then we try to help them experience the identification of feelings, the expression of those feelings, and how to own them, including aggressive energy, which she thinks is really fundamental to having a strong sense of self. And we'll be talking about that in the next segment. She does work through projecting feelings, through drawing stories, sand tray work, etc. And she works with, dealing with emotions related to past trauma, learning skills for dealing with everyday feelings. So feelings are number 4. They come after a lot of this sort of prior work of building self-support, making good contact, having a therapeutic relationship is even in place. And lastly, she talks about this piece she does called self-nurturing work, which is helping children to become self-accepting and self-appreciating and to actively nurture the self. We will go on to talk about these approaches more in the weeks to come. Today, I've tried to highlight the following: the 3 important types of contact, the 4 aspects involved in having good contact with the self, senses, body, emotions, intellect, how rebuilding connection is the key to trauma-informed work, how understanding internalizing and externalizing behaviors on a continuum of contact, and what children might need practice in terms of making better contact, whether that's inhibiting more or exhibiting more, and how contact is related to this ongoing process of self-regulation. Probably the most important thing we can help children do is learn to self-regulate. So I've given examples of regulation at the physiological level, heart rate, emotional level, in terms of what our emotions are helping us express and what needs, and at the cognitive level, which Piaget talks about is happening all the time as well. So, and then lastly, we talked about these 5 steps to the Oaklander therapeutic process, and we'll see her do more of that work as we see her work with children on the video you will be asked to watch, as well as we'll get to experience more of this work ourselves in this class. So once again, thank you for your attention. I will be talking more about emotions next time and keying in on that work, since we've talked more about the basic foundations of contact and regulation and the importance of a strong sense of self before doing emotional work.